Hi, everyone. This is Jackie from Autism Society of Texas. We're just about to start our panel discussion on Robert Roberson, Autism and Injustice. We have some fantastic panelists here today, and I'm going to turn this over to Tracy Staley from the Autism Society of America now, and she'll be moderating this discussion. So thank you all for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. And thank you all for joining today for a webinar hosted by the Autism Society of America, the Autism Society of Texas, and the Innocence Project. Today, we're going to highlight the grave injustice the autism community faces within the criminal legal system. My name is Tracy Staley, and I am the acting CEO at the Autism Society of America. I'll be moderating today's discussion, and I am deeply honored to be joined by an exceptional panel of experts who bring decades of research, advocacy, and lived experience to this critical conversation. So let me introduce our panel. We have Dr. Natalie Montfort. Natalie is a psychologist in Houston, Texas, where she co-founded a private practice with her husband. Their practice specializes in autism assessment and intervention throughout the lifespan. In addition to her clinical work, Dr. Montfort conducts evaluations of autistic people involved in the legal system. She is dedicated to advancing understanding and support for autistic individuals through compassionate, evidence-based care. Our next panelist is Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen. Simon is director of the Autism Research Center in Cambridge University. He has made contributions to many aspects of autism research. In 2017, he gave a keynote address to the United Nations on Autism Awareness Day on the topic of autism and human rights. In 2021, he received a knighthood in the New Year's Honors List for his services to autism. And the Medical Research Council awarded him the MRC Millennium Medal 2023 in recognition of his pioneering MRC-funded research into the prenatal sex steroid theory of autism, his establishment of the ARC, and his work in the public understanding of neurodiversity. We next have Dr. Connie Kasari. Connie is a distinguished professor in the Center for Autism Research and Treatment in the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. She conducts research on social and communication interventions for autistic individuals in school and community. And finally, we have Dr. Matthew Belmonte. Matthew is a brother and uncle to two people with profound autism and serves as research advisor at the Calm Deal Trust, an autism NGO in Bangalore. His work with universities and clinics in India, England, and the United States has asked, what makes the difference between family members with and without autism? Also, what underlies their many similarities? He studies these relationships by measuring how different parts of the brain communicate with each other to control and coordinate attention, cognition, sensory perception, and movement, and how these skills combine to produce social communication. We are deeply grateful to each of our panelists for giving us their time, their expertise, and their voices on this critical issue. But before we dive into today's discussion, I want to take a moment to highlight why we're here and what has brought us together. The Autism Society became involved in the Robert Roberson case in 2024, after several of our partner organizations raised questions and serious concerns about how autism was misunderstood and mishandled during Robert's trial and conviction. Robert Roberson is an autistic father from Texas. He was convicted and sentenced to death following the tragic passing of his 2-year-old daughter. His execution date is October 16th, 2025. Throughout the investigation and the trial, Robert's autism largely went unrecognized, which has profound consequences. His flat affect, and limited eye contact, both common autistic traits, were misinterpreted as lack of remorse. His sensory and communication differences were misunderstood and used against him. Scientific evidence that could have helped contextualize his behavior was not even considered. Despite advances in our understanding of autism and the support of multiple experts, questioning the reliability of the evidence used against him, Robert remains on death row with an execution date of October 16th. But this case is not just about one individual. It represents a broader systemic failure. Autistic individuals are disproportionately criminalized. Their differences in communication and behavior are frequently misinterpreted. And our legal system often lacks the tools and understanding needed to ensure fair and just treatment. Since 2024, the Autism Society has worked with the Innocence Project, legal experts, scientists, and advocacy partners to educate legal teams about autism, push for fair treatment of autistic individuals in the criminal justice legal system, and raise public awareness about Robert Roberson's case and others like it. The Autism Society of Texas petitioned Governor Abbott and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles for clemency, speaking at a press conference outside the governor's office and testifying at a Texas House Committee hearing. The Autism Society of America also mobilized public support, generating 400 letters to the governor through an action alert, and amplified Robert's case through press releases and articles. Recently, we drafted and sent a new open letter to the authorities in Texas, calling Mr. Roberson's execution to be stopped. But before we open up on the broader issue at hand, I'd like to give Natalie a minute to add to Robert's case. Natalie has studied Robert's case and provided expert testimony before the Texas legislature last year after Robert's original execution date was stayed. She has been a tireless advocate, and we are grateful to have her here today. So, Natalie, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm honored to be here with such a prestigious panel of experts today. Today, the Autism Society and the Autism Society of America in Texas are releasing an open letter to Texas authorities urging them to stop the October 16th execution of Robert Roberson, an innocent man with autism who was wrongfully convicted of causing the death of his chronically ill daughter, Nikki, in 2002. The letter stresses that a wealth of evidence proves Nikki's death resulted from illness, improperly prescribed medications, and accident, and was not a crime. Moreover, a lack of awareness and understanding about Mr. Roberson's developmental disabilities seems to have been unwittingly held against him and greatly contributed to his wrongful conviction and death sentence. We're urging Texas leaders to consider the role that Robert's then undiagnosed autism played in the way hospital staff and law enforcement rushed to judge him. Concerns about Mr. Roberson's innocence have generated a groundswell of support in Texas, nationally, and internationally. He was nearly executed last October, but was spared through the intervention of a bipartisan committee of Texas lawmakers through unprecedented developments that cannot be repeated. Yet the quest for a thorough reexamination of Robert's wrongful conviction continues. He currently has habeas petitions, that is appeals, and motions for a stay of execution pending before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, but the clock is ticking. Mr. Roberson was a special education student when he dropped out of school after the 9th grade. He's also a person with autism, which wasn't diagnosed until late in his life. In January 2002, his daughter Nikki was sick with a high fever and undiagnosed pneumonia when she suffered a short fall from bed. Doctors had prescribed her Phenigrin, a powerful medication that's no longer prescribed to children Nikki's age and in her condition because of its respiratory suppressing effects and association with respiratory distress and death. She was also prescribed codeine, a narcotic no longer recommended for anyone under the age of 18. After waking up to find his daughter unresponsive, Robert brought Nikki to the hospital, where medical staff became suspicious of his seeming lack of urgency and lack of emotion. People with autism can come across to neurotypical people as uncaring or detached, especially in times of great distress. Brian Wharton served as the lead detective in the investigation into Mr. Roberson's daughter's death and testified on behalf of the state at trial, including about Robert's flat affect at the time of his arrest. Wharton has admitted that he rushed to judgment because Mr. Roberson did not react to the situation as a, quote, normal parent would. But after reviewing the new evidence, he now believes Mr. Roberson is innocent and he's joined the fight to stop his execution. After Nikki was taken off life support without his knowledge or consent, Mr. Roberson was prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced to death in 2003 under the now discredited shaken baby syndrome hypothesis. The child abuse pediatrician who made the shaken baby syndrome diagnosis did not review Nikki's medical history, documenting a history of unexplained apnea and dangerous prescription medications contraindicated for a child with breathing problems. The medical examiner who performed Nikki's autopsy did not even review the records from her last hospitalization, including CT scans of Nikki's head, establishing she had no skull fractures or any evidence of abuse or battery when she was admitted to the hospital. Mr. Roberson has been fighting for his life as the state of Texas refuses to acknowledge the evidence of his innocence. There's still time for the courts to intervene to prevent an irreparable injustice.
Thank you, Natalie. That was really a helpful background. Let's jump into our panel discussion. And I'm going to start with Matthew Belmonte. Matthew, how do unfamiliar or high-pressure environments such as emergencies or legal settings affect autism individuals? And in what ways can their behavior be misunderstood by others in those situations?
Right. Well, uh, as per the introduction, one of the things I study is brain connectivity in autism. That is the ways in which different parts of the brain communicate with each other and integrate with each other, or do not integrate with each other, to produce cognition. And in non-autistic people, when the world gets too loud or too intense, uh, we non-autistic people can use the brain's control systems to kind of put the brakes on the senses, to turn down the volume. The thing is, there are aspects of those same brain control systems that are also called upon to do a lot of other tasks, including tamping down intense emotions that well up, um, coordinating attention and eye contact, uh, and controlling and coordinating thoughts. When we think deeply, we put a great demand on those brain coordination systems. So when you have a lot going on in those sensory, emotional, and cognitive worlds all at the same time, things can fall apart. And in fact, all of those capacities can fall apart simultaneously. Um, so all of a sudden, if you were able to act like a non-autistic person, if you were able to maintain eye contact, well, you can't anymore because there's just too much going on and you disengage. Debbie Ryby actually has shown that disengagement of eye contact is a strategy that autistic people use to manage this kind of cognitive load. Um, you disengage from the social world in general. You just kind of shut down, uh, and uh, and allow things to wash over you. Um, Now, I think all of us, autistic or not, have had those experiences where the world gets too much for us. But the difference in people with autism is that threshold can be so much lower than it is for the rest of us. The situations in which we would expect them to, as Natalie was saying, act normal. They can't do that anymore. They can't put up the act. They can't do the camouflaging. So of course, precisely because, uh, here you are, you're in an unfamiliar setting with all these doctors and nurses and medical staff that, are people, are strangers to you. Um, and they're all rushing around doing these things. There are all these machines going beep and making strange sounds. It's a hubbub. It's a very difficult sensory situation. And added on top of that, your kid is lying there dying. I mean, how are you going to deal with that? Uh, if you can't, if you can't put up the camouflage anymore, you just shut down. And the tragedy of autism, not just in Robert's case, but in so many whose stories are not told, is that this behavior, which is an attempt by the autistic person to manage the sound and fury of the world, is misinterpreted as a lack of care. In fact, it's just the opposite. Because too much is going on inside that head, the only possible response is to shut down and to disengage.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, I forgot to mention that we hope to save some time at the end for questions. So if anybody has a question, they can type it in the comments section. But let's go on to Natalie. Natalie, could you explain how neurological differences in autistic individuals can affect their communication and behavior during interactions with the criminal justice system? Maybe you could share any examples from cases you're familiar with that illustrate how these differences may be misunderstood.
These neurological or brain-based differences in autistic people can significantly impact how they communicate or behave in these types of situations. You heard from Matthew about the sensory system, so kind of touch on other areas here. But Mr. Robertson's case is an excellent example of how these symptoms can be misunderstood, misinterpreted. But his case is just that. It's an example, one of many. Um, Autistic individuals also have differences in social communication, and that may cause them to interpret language literally. They might speak in a more monotone voice or have difficulty understanding the full meaning of what's said to them, or difficulty expressing themselves, especially we learned when under pressure, experiencing strong emotions. So, because of his autism, Mr. Roberson was not outwardly able to show the emotions he was experiencing as his daughter was in the hospital. Um, Alternatively, nonverbal cues like eye contact or body language might be interpreted differently by either partner, or they might even be avoided altogether by the autistic person, which can be interpreted by non-autistic people as evasiveness or guilt. Eye contact has a strong cultural meaning in different cultures. So the other thing that can be a factor are executive functioning challenges. If they're present, and they often are, especially in my experience of people with autism who are involved in the criminal justice system. So challenges in these areas of executive functioning might look like difficulties with impulse control, difficulties organizing thoughts, or understanding and predicting the consequences of their actions. So in legal settings, these challenges could look like behavior that's erratic, non-compliant, when really it just stems from these cognitive processing differences. And that can unfairly influence perceptions of credibility or intent, leading to prejudgment. So problem solving can be quite different. In Mr. Roberson's case, his decision to dress his daughter, Nikki, before taking him to the hospital, his later decision to make a sandwich during a police walkthrough of his home, those were actions that were seen as callous and uncaring. For him, they were important rules and parts of the day and routines that he was following to be the best father that he could be in that moment. I've had cases where autistic men are accused of stalking or harassment because of repetitive interactions, which can be a difference in social communication. And then their differences in problem solving might be misinterpreted. So, they may react to a situation that is not the same way that non-autistic men would respond to that situation in most cases. And instead of being seen as a difference in thinking and processing, it's often viewed as guilt, or, something that they've intentionally done wrong. So repetitive behaviors, restricted interests are another area we see lots of problems. Those are often referred to as stimming. They're common among autistic individuals, and they serve as a coping mechanism. It could look like hand flapping, vocal repetition. These things could be mistaken for drug use, substance use, psychiatric symptoms. They can sometimes lead to unnecessary escalation with involvement with law enforcement, hospitalization, even arrest. So I'm aware of multiple cases where echolalia, or repeating something heard elsewhere, has been misjudged and resulted in terroristic charges, a felony charge for terroristic threats.
Mm.
In another case, a young man with an intellectual disability and autism was enjoying an independent walk in public near some storefronts, which, he is by all means allowed to do. Nearby employees saw him. They called police. They stated he was behaving unpredictably. They stated they felt threatened by his presence. So security officers came, not even police. They forcefully restrained him, detained him in a security office for several hours before his family finally found him and demanded he be released. And they fought the family on releasing him. So literal thinking and high suggestibility also affect interactions with law enforcement more directly. They might provide incomplete or misleading answers during questioning just because they're trying to comply, or they're overwhelmed emotionally or from a sensory standpoint. And I've seen this result in confessions, false confessions, or misinterpretation of their intent. So false confessions are also a concern when the interrogating officers use deception. And the autistic person believes that they're going to get to leave this awful interrogation and this horrible sensory environment if they just say they're guilty, even though they're not. But when police say things like, or, investigators say things like, we'll help you if you just tell us this is what happened. It's going to be okay if you just say that you did it. We already know. Oftentimes they may comply.
Mm.
So, and lastly, many autistic individuals may have difficulty comprehending the unfamiliar legal jargon, including Miranda rights or plea deals, which makes them really vulnerable during interrogations or court proceedings. So this kind of misinterpretation of autistic traits is a systemic issue. All of these behaviors that we've heard about, monotone speech, differences in eye contact, differences in posture, they're often judged as dishonesty or guilt. And they can influence juror perceptions, judicial outcomes. So it goes even beyond just the law enforcement. Without a formal diagnosis, the courts, like in Mr. Roberson's case, may even overlook an alternate explanation for these factors. So really, to ensure justice is just, we need to recognize and accommodate the neurological differences that shape autistic people's experiences, that make their experience different. We need to train law enforcement and legal professionals, provide legal accommodations and autism-aware advocacy. And those are the critical steps toward equitable treatment.
Thank you, Natalie. Our next question is for Simon. Could you speak to the research that highlights the challenges autistic individuals face within the criminal justice system, and maybe share examples of effective supports or protections used in other countries that the U.S. could consider adopting?
Sure. Before I turn to the research, maybe it's important to just to sort of to explain that I have served as an expert witness in many legal cases where an autistic person has been arrested and got tangled up in the criminal justice system. And the role of the expert witness, often a psychologist or a psychiatrist, is really to educate the court and the jury about the role that autism might have played in why this person has ended up being arrested or been accused of certain things. But often, an expert witness is not brought in. And so all of the things we've heard so far from Natalie, from Matthew, about misunderstandings surrounding the autistic person's behavior leaves them very, very vulnerable. That their behavior is interpreted as guilt. So I wanted to just start, before I get into the research, by just highlighting the human tragedy that's happened in Robert's case. He's been in prison for 20 years. And from what we hear, and we're not experts in this particular case, but from what we hear, he is innocent of the charges that have been leveled against him. So that's one tragedy, that he's spent, an autistic person has been in prison for 20 years. And prisons are not the right place for autistic people, for all the reasons that Matthew has described in terms of their sensory hypersensitivity. Prisons are very noisy, challenging environments. There's a second human tragedy, of course, which is that he could lose his life next month. And this is upsetting for all of us to even imagine. Just to remind ourselves, we're talking about what seems to be an innocent man who has a disability being executed. I mean, it's heartbreaking, and that's why we're here tonight. In my case tonight, I'm in the UK today, to really kind of draw attention to this looming tragedy. There's a third tragedy, which is the death of his daughter. 2-year-old Nikki, whose death may have been caused by medical factors, nothing to do with Robert, and the fact that was misdiagnosed. So we've got a whole bunch of human tragedies to deal with. I want to sort of maybe come back to this concept that's floating around in autism research at the moment called the double empathy problem. Some of you may have heard of this, but it's the idea that some autistic people may struggle to understand other people's perspectives, but equally, non-autistic people may struggle to understand the autistic person's perspective. And what happened in the hospital that day, and subsequently with the law enforcement officers, is a really good example of the double empathy problem where communication breaks down. So Robert was not able to perhaps be aware of how he appeared to the nursing staff, the doctors, the police. He didn't realize perhaps that the way his facial expression was presenting, or his behavior more generally, could be interpreted as signs of guilt. Matthew explained that could be the result of the sensory overload and the information overload, and having to juggle so much competing information at one time. It could also be, partly the difficulty, the well-established disability in taking another perspective, what's called theory of mind. But either way, he was dealing with a very sick daughter who was unresponsive. So he had so much that he had to cope with, but was very prone to misinterpretation of his behavior. So there's been some mention already about how autistic people can be exploited. So I might want to try and generalize this to other legal cases that I've come across. Exploited for their naivety. Natalie was giving the example of when under interview, autistic people might be easily deceived. I've met autistic people who've been exploited in other ways because of their social naivety. It's part of their disability. So, for example, they might be asked to carry a bag that contains a gun because then their fingerprints are on the bag, even though it's other people who are the bad guys, but they end up becoming incriminated in a crime. Lots of examples, of autistic people who get offered gifts to carry things, which might be drugs across county lines. This is a growing problem that we've become aware of. Also, autistic people who go onto the web sometimes find themselves into the dark web and join chat rooms where they're discussing things that they don't realize are very risky topics to be discussing. So the social naivety is driving their behavior, and they may become groomed or exploited by others who are intending to do bad things. And the autistic person is only there because maybe they're very socially isolated and are quite grateful to have any social contact with people who claim to be their friends. So lots of examples of how an autistic person can end up being arrested. In our research, we've found that autistic people are at increased risk of being arrested. In our study we published in 2019, about 20% of autistic people had been arrested, much higher than non-autistic people. Arrested on the basis of misunderstandings. I've seen cases where autistic people follow their strong interests without realizing the risks. So if you type into a search engine, words like Islam and ISIS, because you're interested in those topics, and you start pursuing those topics in an obsessive way, you may find you get a knock on the door and you get arrested under the, suspicion of terrorism, as Natalie mentioned, purely because for autistic people, they may just be interested and go deeper and deeper into one particular topic and not be aware that the terms they're putting into search engines like Google are being monitored. So when autistic people are arrested, because they have a disability, they should be entitled to reasonable adjustments or reasonable accommodations under the law. That could be, for example, being offered an intermediary. Sometimes it's called an appropriate adult, somebody to explain the legal process, to make sure that the autistic person is understanding all of the language that's being used and what's, the implications of what's about to happen. What we found in other research, which we published in 2022, was that when we asked both defendants, autistic people who'd been arrested, or their lawyers, we found in the vast majority of cases, autistic people who are arrested are not offered reasonable accommodations, despite it being their legal right. So it means that the system has got a long way to go in terms of being fair and just. I think this is what Natalie meant by talking about a systemic problem, that autistic people, as a minority in our society are more at risk, but the criminal justice is just not yet designed to make sure that they have fair access to justice. And as a result, just like Robert's case, you can end up with wrongful convictions where he has been assumed to be guilty on the basis of things like facial expression, body language, when a good criminal justice system would say you should be innocent until you're proven guilty, where the proof should be really watertight. But at the moment, we know that a lot of autistic people are slipping through the cracks and ending up in jail where they shouldn't be. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think there's a lot of scope for training of the police, training of judges, training of lawyers, training of social workers, a lot of different allied professionals to make sure that when an autistic person is arrested, their situation, their case can be seen within the framework of disability and hopefully diverted away from the criminal justice system and towards what in the UK we call the social care system, so health, social services, understood in the proper context of the disability. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Simon. Before we go to our next question, I want to remind everybody that we welcome any questions. If you can type them in the comments section, we will address them or have our panel address them after this next question. So let's move to Connie. Connie, what are the consequences of the lack of consistent autism training among criminal justice professionals, such as the police, lawyers, and judges? And how can expert testimony and standardized procedures help ensure fairer outcomes for autistic individuals?
Well, I think the consequences are what we're hearing about today, right? So you can imagine 50 years ago when Robert was probably in school, starting school. I'm not sure what year he was born, but I think it was more than 50 years ago. You know, he was a child in a school where not very many people knew anything about autism. The teachers didn't know, the doctors didn't know, the professionals didn't know. And so he had a different diagnosis. He had a language delay. And that's pretty typical. Not very many people knew about autism. And in fact, if I'm right, I'm not even sure that he was in school once we had federal laws guaranteeing a free and public education for all children with any kind of disability. And so he kind of missed out probably on the supports and the things that he needed to flourish in school. And in fact, that seems likely since he dropped out in the 9th grade. So you can, for the people that are listening now, many people have never met a person with autism, probably, never went to school with them. It wasn't that common. And, you know, things have changed in the last 50 years in terms of our science, our ability to identify, to diagnose, and to treat or intervene with individuals with autism. So a lot has happened. But while we've gotten better in schools, for example, in public schools, if the characteristics of your disability are present, you can't be punished or expelled from school based on those characteristics, that we accommodate those. Once you become an adult, you know, we're not as good about in terms of training the community. So whether that's just community workers, policemen, lawyers, judges, there are programs. There has been a big push to have more training in the community, but they're not consistent. And as a result, the accommodations that supports the policies are not system-wide. And that really needs to change. So I think we could learn something from the UK by giving individuals an appropriate adult or an expert to make sure that they're capable of understanding the procedures, what is happening to them, and that they have the accommodations. For example, I was wondering in the court system whether he had visual support. So a lot of times our autistic individuals need things both auditorily, but also visually. And that helps them to understand or to process the procedures. So there are very simple accommodations that could help us, I think, in terms of improving what's happening especially in community systems.
Thank you, Connie. Before we jump into the Q&A, though, let me open it up to the panel. Do you all have anything else you want to add that you think our audience would be interested in or needs to hear?
Yeah. You know, let me follow up what a couple of my fellow panelists have said. In terms of interpretations of behavior, I don't know how many times, countless times, I've heard it from others. Well, certainly, you know, within my own family, you know, when my elder brother would have a meltdown, right? I mean, so many autistic people are cop magnets. And I think a lot of that is down, as people have mentioned, to the assumptions that people make, the lack of training to negate or suspend those assumptions. Um, the inference is that uh, anyone whose behavior is different, unconventional, may be viewed as not appropriate to the context. Um, and perhaps inexplicable within a non-autistic frame of reference. To get back to what Simon was saying about the double empathy problem, the inference that people make is that something's going on here. Something's not right. This person is not right. This person is a threat. Uh,
Mm.
and that is what draws so many people with autism into contact with the police in the first place. And unfortunately, often when you're a little different and you're drawn into contact with the police, it just spirals. And bad things ensue. And what the authorities are looking for, often they will find one way or another in a process of confirmation bias. So I just want to accentuate the point that
Mm.
uh, so much of autistic behavior is uh, something that draws people into that system in the first place. And if we could choose one point of intervention, well, actually, I mean, I think if we could choose one point of intervention, it would be, training children in schools to respect differences, so that the children who grow up into cops or judges or jury members or whoever would carry that training with them into life. But failing that, maybe at least we could put a barrier in that first line of contact with the legal system by training the police.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
really important. And there are so many people who join police departments, certainly in the United States, who want to do good things. They want to give back to the community and all this. But often they don't have that training. And there are in different countries, I know in the UK, degrees in policing are more common, degrees in criminal justice. People can study some psychology. In other countries, that's not quite as common. No, I'm not holding the UK up as a model because as Simon has pointed out, there are many, many shortcomings there too. But
Mm.
this is the kind of place that we really have to intervene, training those first line responders to understand and to de-escalate.
Mm.
Simon, I see you have raised your hand. If we
Yeah.
are starting to get questions in, and actually, I
Okay.
think the first one would be a good one for you to ask or answer, I'm sorry. What would you recommend to researchers who are family facing and encounter many of these situations, especially within marginalized communities? How can we push for this advocacy?
Mm. Um, yeah, I think researchers are one community that we need to raise awareness among. But, I'm picking up on Matthew's point that the police are another one, and maybe a more urgent one, because the police are out on the street and they're making arrests every day, every day of the year. One thing I've heard about in the UK, and I don't know if any of the people on the panel in the US can comment, is autistic people carrying a card saying, I am autistic.
Mhm.
And that's fine if the person has a diagnosis already. And if they find themselves in a situation where they feel they can't explain verbally what
Mhm.
what their situation is, they could at least take out this card, and that might be enough of a cue to a police officer to think maybe this person needs a different way of the whole process being managed. The problem I was going to raise whilst Matthew was talking is, what do you do in the case of somebody like Robert who didn't have an autism diagnosis at the time? As Connie said, he had his childhood developmental profile, which was language delay, maybe some difficulties in school, but no formal diagnosis of autism. And that happens a lot, that the autism diagnosis only comes later, after the point of arrest or when the person's already in prison. So there's a lot of things that we have to try and address.
Can I respond
Of
to that?
course.
Well, so I was going to say that a lot of times in marginalized communities, what parents will do is they will go and take their child to meet the police department so that the police actually know their child, because a lot of times people are responding to the individual with fear. And again, because they haven't met people with autism, they haven't interacted with them. We're not a society that is that inclusive. We're getting better, but we're not that inclusive. And so by being proactive, that helps. And in response to you, Matthew, about the children, I don't know that it's the children we need to teach. The kids in school can be great. It's the adults in that environment that need to kind of create the climate and the community so that, children understand those differences and interact. But the kids, at least when they're really young, are pretty accepting. So those are my couple of points.
Okay, we're getting lots of questions in, so I'm going to dive in. This is an interesting question that I don't know if any of our panelists know the answer to this. Why are autistic people sometimes arrested for behaviors linked to their disability? Isn't there a law that protects them?
You have to know what those again, they're responding with fear. They
Right.
see something that's different. They don't have an experience with that. They're categorizing it with somebody who might be a real criminal. And so I think they respond in that way. They are protected. They should be protected. For example, Robert should be protected in this situation. He has a disability. He should not be executed. And I think, Matthew, you brought up a legal case in which that was, put forth.
So our next question is, how can defense attorneys be a better advocate for their autistic clients? I understand educating yourself in the first step, but how would you go about explaining it to a judge or a jury?
Mm-hmm.
Natalie, that sounds
Yeah,
like
I can
right up
speak a little
your
bit to
alley.
that. So when we talk to a judge or a jury, what we want them to understand is this isn't a mental illness. This isn't lack of education. This is a brain-based difference that's present before birth. There's studies that show differences in utero. And so this is a different way of perceiving and being in the world. And I've had the benefit of working with some very experienced attorneys who really go this route of this is a social learning disorder. The individual acquires and uses eye contact differently for a different purpose, even when they make good eye contact. And so they're not always gaining the same information that non-autistic people are. And they're not always, the double empathy problem that Simon talked about really nails it. If you're not familiar with that, do go look that up, because it talks about, why non-autistic people would misperceive. And so that's really what we need to educate the judge and the jury on, are that there are other explanations for what was assumed in this case. And I've had a lot of those cases where individuals are just, in trouble even for crimes they didn't commit. A young man who wanted to go to a young woman's house, and while he was on the way, she said, "Oh, by the way, I'm a minor child." And she was a police officer. It was a sting operation. He decided to continue to her house, not because he was going to do what they talked about, but upon interview, he said, "Well, I'm going to, stay and tell her mother why she is
Mm.
doing this online if she's a child? The mom needs to know. And if she really is the age she said she is, maybe we could do what we talked about. But that's not how a non-autistic person in that situation would typically solve the problem. Does that make it criminal that it was thought about differently? So that's where the education is with the judge and the jury. And then we offer education as an alternative to incarceration in these cases where, okay, don't even drive towards that person's house. But in a case like Robert's, what's so tragic is he's the victim. He's experienced this horrific loss of his daughter, and now it's been criminalized. Not only has he not gotten to grieve and continue his life free, he now has to deal with the lawsuit that, just like you've heard, looks like, should never have happened. The medical evidence, though we're not doctors of medicine, seems quite profound. But he wasn't able to communicate that. And so his first attorney, there was a real problem in the case. The first attorney just said, here's the thing, you did it. Let's just try to keep you from getting the death penalty. And he wasn't able to advocate for himself and say no. I mean, he never has admitted to harming his daughter in any way. Never. And even that first attorney who represented him was simply, well, you're guilty. Let's just try to keep you alive. Was the first strategy in his defense. I know, again, if he'd had what Simon's talking about, this helper to understand the process could have been changing for him.
So that's a great transition to the next question. Forgive me if I'm misunderstanding, but this responsible adult advocate, aside from a possible awareness gap, does this fall into the realm of the defense attorney, part of a zealous advocate? Simon, maybe you can give us a few more details about that.
I mean, often the defense attorney, or in my country, it would be called the solicitor or the barrister, the lawyer. They're just trying to assemble the legal case in terms of legal argument. You need somebody who's trained in working with autistic people to be the intermediary. And I wanted to pick up on, Connie's point that some of these reasonable adjustments or accommodations don't need to be particularly expensive. Connie, you gave the example of maybe using visual information for somebody who finds it a struggle to process a lot of words, a lot of language. And that would be one example that's low cost, using pictures. But in my country, sometimes the judge wears a wig, and the attorneys wear wigs because that's part of the history and the tradition. That can be very intimidating for an autistic person who's never seen that, and very distracting. So there could be a very low cost accommodation of asking the judges to take off their wigs. Or it could be that, the autistic person going into a new place like the courtroom would be overwhelmed by unpredictability. We know autistic people have a strong preference for predictability and familiarity, and they get very stressed if they're in an unpredictable, novel environment. So, a reasonable low-cost accommodation would be to take the autistic person there before the court trial happens, show them where they're going to be sitting, show them who's going to be speaking and when, just giving them more of a structure. Because once there's a structure, then the world becomes a little bit more easy to navigate. So lots of these kind of low-cost accommodations, offering the person frequent breaks. Because if the person's stress levels are rising, the autistic person's stress levels are rising, so that they can't answer a question coherently, even just having a short break more frequently than a non-autistic person doesn't cost much. And it makes sure that we're getting closer to real access to justice. And then, of course, changing the language that's used. Sometimes autistic people struggle with figurative language, with metaphorical language, non-literal language. So keeping the questions much more factual, closed questions where there's a yes or no answer rather than these open-ended, ambiguous questions. Things that don't cost a lot, but we really need to train our legal system to be conscious of these things.
Mm-hmm. So we have a comment from an autistic viewer that I'd like to read. I am an autistic, and while I have never been arrested, all of the traffic stops that I have been in have happened when I was very distressed. I go into a panic when that happens. I shut down. I don't show emotions, and officers get belligerent and seem to be trying to provoke a reaction from me. I tend to be trusting and optimistic and think that they are going to help when that is not the case. Thank you for sharing that comment. We have another question, and I think we only have time for a couple more questions. Have disability rights organizations or the Innocence Projects been successful? I know that in less than a month, this individual has the possibility of being executed. In general, have these groups been successful? If not, what else could be done? Are there any other groups we should be aware of?
I think
Natalie, I'm sorry, Simon, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we on the panel are very pleased to be lending our voice and our names to the open letter and the press release to really raise awareness of Robert's case, because the clock is ticking, and we just urge everyone who's listening today to raise awareness of Robert's case in any way they can.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, we are getting close to the end. We have a couple of comments that we just have time to read. I thought it would be worthwhile. How about an appropriate adult program for vulnerable people in custody? Is anybody aware of anything like that, either in the UK or US or elsewhere? Sounds like no.
Well, I know that if I recall correctly, it was Montgomery County, Maryland, has trained police in interaction with autistic people. Now, it's not quite the same as a program for people who are in custody, but of course, it affects the pathway to custody. So, that's some progress. I also want to mention, Connie mentioned a court case that I had cited. So there was a case back in 2002, which of course was a rather different Supreme Court. But anyway, it concerned the application of the death penalty to those with intellectual disability in particular, and that of course is different from autism.
Right.
Sometimes overlaps, sometimes doesn't. But its argument about reduced culpability could be applied, I think, equally well to cases in which autism might have driven the offense, or in Robert's case, the conviction. So, maybe there's hope for the future there.
So we have to start to wrap up, unfortunately. I do want to end with a comment that came in from Facebook. With Robert's story on the spotlight, unfortunately, there's been a huge portion of evidence and research finding that there are a lot of BIPOC autistics, especially our friends from the autistic Black community, are getting much harsher punishments and horrific treatments due to stigma and stereotypes being reinforced towards BIPOC and the Black autistic community. This is something we need to be more aware about and to take action for, no matter which community they come from. Everyone on the spectrum, especially BIPOC autistics, deserve respect, kindness, and give back their identity, pride, and dignity. The other comment I wanted to make is that many of our Autism Society affiliates do offer training to first responders, police, judges, and we are happy to partner with any communities and any law enforcement agencies to help improve the situation for everyone. But let's start to wrap this up. As we've heard today, Robert Robertson's case is not an isolated incident. It's a call to action for policymakers, legal professionals, advocates, and our entire community to work together to ensure justice that recognizes neurodiversity. The Autism Society of America and the Autism Society of Texas remain committed to fighting for systemic reforms, elevating science-informed advocacy, and ensuring that autistic individuals are treated with dignity, fairness at every step of the legal process. Please see our call to action on the screen. You can get a link through the QR code to see more detail there. Please use our action alert to message your lawmakers on the importance of the case, and you can reach out to our website, which is autismsociety.org. Finally, I'd like to thank our incredible panelists and to the Innocence Project and their support for Robert and the webinar today, and to all of you for joining us. Together, we can and must make the system work better for everyone. Thank you very much.